Hello, everyone. I am Jay Loff. I'm the president and co-founder of Charter. And on behalf of all of us here at Charter and our partners at LifeLabs Learning and Brand Live, I want to welcome you to the first in our 2023 series, the Charter Skills Accelerator with LifeLabs Learning. And as the word series implies, we have done a number of these and we'll do a number of these this year. If you have missed any of the prior sessions, we had 4 incredible sessions in 2022. And if you missed any of those and would like to view them, you can click on the link that should be in the chat right now and go back and watch those on demand, free of charge. And at that same link, you'll find information on subsequent sessions and mini workshops that we will be doing under the Charter Skills Accelerator brand. I believe that we're promoting right now the February 22nd session, which is the next in this series on Productivity Lab. So hopefully you'll bookmark that link and refer to it often. We'll be producing roughly one of these every month this year throughout 2023, and we look forward to seeing you at those. Charter Skills Accelerator series is just one of the many ways in which we at Charter try to deliver on our mission, which is to help owners of the talent agenda transform your organizations to be more fair and more dynamic, places where all workers and thereby your companies can thrive. So this is one of the ways in which we do it. Another that I'll briefly touch on and that you'll see a link for in the chat right now as well is a new offering from us, which is Charter Pro. This is a membership for senior leaders in people ops, HR, or really at the executive level that will help you in your workplace transformation efforts. You'll receive an exclusive email that is full of insights and information that is actionable and delivered throughout the week. Original research, comprehensive research from our growing research team. We run boot camps and offer advisory services as part of the Charter Pro membership. And if you want to hear more, have any questions, or are interested in becoming a member, again, click on that link and certainly reach out to us. We'd love to help you do that. This series, I should mention, is not possible, certainly not possible at no charge as well, without the generous participation and support of our partners. LifeLabs Learning is expert at what you're about to experience here, running workshops and training sessions on a variety of elements of workplace, both transformation and workplace excellence. They're an incredible partner, and we're proud to be associated with them and have them program our production today. This is also not possible without the generous support of Brand Live, who is the official streaming partner of any remote event like this that we do at Charter, and is the underwriter for the Skills Accelerator series. So I want to give just a minute to Brand Live's CEO and co-founder, Sam Colbert-Heil, to tell you a little bit about Brand Live before we get going. Sam?
We're thrilled to sponsor this series from LifeLabs Learning and Charter, and hope it's a shining example of what's possible. Because let's face it, it's 2022, and everyone is bored out of their minds with talking heads in little boxes. At Brand Live, we're injecting a little bit of soul into this thing we're calling hybrid work. Whether it's a webinar series like this one, your biggest marquee event of the year, a new hire onboarding series, or your next town hall. We're reinventing how companies and leaders communicate with video so that shows look and feel like the television and TikToks we're watching outside of work, with tools and formulas and creative support to help you tell stories and create something worth watching, whether it's live or on demand. Because the key to making sure your audience doesn't tune out is to make it so good they'll tune in. We hope you enjoyed today's show, and thanks for joining us.
All right, we're just about to get started. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items. One is I hope you're already using and saying hello to each other in the chat function. That'll also be a mechanism to interact with our facilitator for today. We'll do that at the prompting of our facilitator, who will, prompt you to ask questions or respond to various prompts of hers throughout the session. And we do it that way to ensure a seamless program and delivery of this incredible workshop. Lastly, in the chat at the end of the session, we will field a survey that I encourage all of you to please take a moment to fill out. It doesn't take more than just a few seconds, but it's been really instrumental in helping us continue to iterate on and improve this program for you. So do take some time at the end of the session to do that. We hope you will. And now, without further ado, I want to introduce actually the head facilitator for all of LifeLabs Learning, someone with a PhD in industrial organization psychology. We're excited to have her here with us today. It's McKendry Hickory from LifeLabs Learning. McKendry, take it away.
Thanks, Jay, and hello to everyone. Nice to meet you. As Jay said, my name is McKendry Hickory. I'm the head of facilitation at LifeLabs, and I'm just really excited to be with you all today to talk about one of my all-time favorite topics, which is feedback. And I think feedback is relevant always. It's relevant in giving performance reviews. It's relevant in building organizational culture. And what we'll really zero in on today are some really practical small tips that are going to make a really big impact when it comes to not only delivering feedback, but also how we receive it. And then perhaps even more importantly, how do we really design a culture of feedback? So let's go ahead and dive into it. So as I said, today's topic is all about building an effective feedback culture. And I would say what gets me really excited about this conversation is I want to talk about this really robustly, if you will. So often we hear about feedback in maybe more isolated conversations, like how do I give feedback well in this situation? Or what does feedback look like in the context of a performance management conversation? And I really want to make the case that it is the culture of feedback that is actually going to make the biggest difference to create that transformation in our organizations. So that's what we're going to tackle today. As we get into it, I want to share a little bit about who we are at LifeLabs and the type of work that we do. So we provide in-person and virtual trainings for teams and managers and executives at some really incredible companies. And when we partner with these organizations, not only do we get to help support and deliver the services of our workshops and our sessions, but we also get the opportunity to go into organizations and really understand who here does this skill really, really well. And then we actually research and understand what are those people doing differently. And so what I'm going to share today really comes from both what we know from organizational research and psychology, but also from what we've seen happening in organizations with real people and understanding what makes a great feedback giver better than just an average person. So that's what we're going to dive into. I would love this to be as interactive as possible in this format. So please leverage that Q&A function. I've got about 3 key topics that I want to cover, and I'll pause after each one to see what questions you all might have to make sure that I can also answer those as we get into it. And before I even dive into some of the skills we're going to cover today, I actually want to prompt us all for even just a moment here, perhaps a bit of a thought experiment around when it comes to giving feedback, receiving feedback, helping cultivate a feedback culture. What has been uniquely challenging and changing in the past couple of years? And to kind of set the stage, right, you all know what we've lived through in the past couple of years. And interestingly enough, not only just a transition to global and to more distributed work has an impact on feedback, but really the dynamics of that we're seeing impact how people respond to it, how often people are giving feedback. So I'll let you just kind of take this. Maybe it's a note you take for yourself, but what have you noticed changing, and even in your own work environment as it pertains to feedback? And as you think about that, I'll share some of the research that we did in the past couple of years. So relatively informal, but working with a number of the organizations and participants we've had the opportunity to train, we started asking this question around how has feedback changed? What is really challenging about your feedback culture in this new context we find ourselves in? And this may or may not be surprising. This may have been some of the things that were even coming top of mind for you. But in general, people are just getting less feedback. And there's a variety of reasons for that I'll speak to in just a moment. But in general, a majority of folks are saying like, hey, I used to get some, now I'm not getting any. Or I used to get a lot, and now I'm just getting a small portion of feedback. We're also seeing that people aren't giving feedback well. So I know you can't all see each other, but I'm sure, like, show of hands, how many of you have gotten poor feedback, right? In the past maybe 2, 3, 6 months, right? Either somebody didn't think about the feedback that they gave it in a way that was really like offensive or really confusing. You didn't know what to do with it. And then finally, a piece that I don't always hear us talking about as much, but I think is equally important, is not receiving feedback well. So if you've ever had the experience of like building up maybe even courage, if it took that, and you approach someone and you give them some feedback and they just like totally blow up, or my personal like least favorite is when somebody just like goes silent and they're like, okay. And you know, like they're not going to change. They didn't take that feedback at all. They didn't receive it, right? And now we've just kind of like, what have we done now to that relationship dynamic? So a variety of challenges, likely some of these are ones that you all have experienced as well. And I'll speak briefly to some of the reasons that this is happening. So some reasons that this happens, and particularly for organizations that are in any type of distributed or hybrid setup, is the impact of trust in psychological safety. And so we know that trust is a process. It takes time to build trust with people. And if we're doing it in a remote environment, if we are not really intentional about building trust, it typically is going to take a lot more time. We also are losing out on all of the visual cues that we tend to pick up on in a difficult conversation, which sometimes feedback conversations can be. So you can't tell if I'm crossing my arms and I'm super mad about it, right? If I'm camera off, you have no idea how I'm responding to that. That's one reason why we're seeing some of these challenges. Another is an interesting phenomenon we're seeing a lot of, which we're kind of calling stockpiling, right? That since I'm not kind of running into you in a hallway, or we're not having some of our, casual lunch conversations that we used to, I'm creating a sticky note list of all the things, right, that you've done that I want to share with you. And then we meet every 2 weeks and I just like unload it all. So we're kind of stockpiling that feedback, which as a recipient of it, obviously can be pretty overwhelming in hearing a bunch of things at the same time. Another one I'll share, because I think this is particularly important in a remote and hybrid environment, is the misattribution of weak signals. And so misattribution, right, this idea that we are like misattributing what it is that we're reading. For me, the best example, in particularly in like a video conference setting, is the understanding of silence. And so, if I'm presenting and people don't respond, right, no one comes off mute, nobody says anything in the chat, my mind is going to quickly jump to a whole host of stories asking like, why are they silent, right? And typically it's not the most generous answer. I'm not like, wow, they're just so wowed by me that they're just speechless, right? No, most often we're like, okay, they hate this, right? They're bored, they're emailing, they're doing something else. So we misattribute those types of signals. And then last but not least, we're seeing that we're all so busy, right? We're in so many back-to-back meetings that when we do give feedback, we're almost in this like efficiency mode where all we're doing is just sharing like the things that have to change. The impact of that is people are hearing way more negative and critical feedback than the positive. And in a couple of moments, we'll talk about the importance of balance, because we really want to make sure that we are giving people both that constructive, critical feedback that's going to make a change, and also sharing with people like, hey, here's the things that you are doing well. And we really need to have a bit of a balance there. So I'm sharing all of this to maybe hopefully give you some language for maybe some of the experiences you've had in the past couple of years as it pertains to feedback. But I also want you to kind of have a lens on to be able to diagnose some of your organizational challenges, right? Some of these may be stronger for some organizations than others, but now I hope you have a bit of a lens that you can now diagnose a bit more specifically some of the unique challenges your team or company might be facing. So with all of that, let's go ahead and transition into how we are going to talk about giving better feedback. As I shared, this is something that we have spent a ton of time at LifeLabs really dissecting and understanding, and really breaking it down into the small changes that are going to lead to a really big impact. So here are our topics for the rest of our time together. The first place I want to start is how to make feedback brain friendly. So, how do we give feedback in a way that people can actually hear it, they can process it, then they can actually do something with it? Then we'll transition into making feedback balanced. And then we'll spend the rest of the time talking about how to really build a system so that really cultivates a feedback culture in your organization. So these are the three areas we're going to talk about. As I mentioned, I will pause after each section to do a quick Q&A. So if you've got a question coming up as I go through this, feel free to send that into the chat. And then Sophia here on my team will make sure that I can see that and I'll answer it as we get going. All right, let's talk about making feedback brain friendly. So I want you, wherever you are in the world, hopefully you have a pen and a paper or something that you can take some notes on. If you would like to, I would love for you to go ahead and draw this grid that you see on the screen. I am a huge fan of workshops actually being workshops. And so you might even take a moment to consider a feedback example you have in mind, right? Maybe somebody did something and you haven't had the chance to share it, whether it's positive or more constructive. What this grid is the LifeLabs feedback grid. And when we do this workshop, and we touch on this in a variety of the workshops we offer our clients, we work through all of these four components of the grids with participants and really giving them a chance to practice after each moment. Now, we're not all interacting, so we're not going to be able to get that practice moment, but I do want you to walk away having had a chance to try out this grid and really deeply understand a bit more how to give that really effective feedback. So once you have this grid, let's go ahead and start with what gets in the way of receiving feedback in the first place. So there is a pink dot here on the slide, and if I could ask one of you to answer, I would, but since we can't do that, I'm going to open it up and just share that this is the amygdala. And the amygdala is a really important brain function. The amygdala is one of the key reasons that we can react really quickly when we feel a threat. And as you might guess where we're headed here, it can also prevent us from hearing feedback in a really useful way. So if somebody gives us feedback or presents feedback in a way that we perceive as threatening, what we might experience is what psychologists call an amygdala hijack. And essentially, your amygdala hijacks your brain's ability to logically hear whatever it is that they're sharing with you. So if you are familiar with the concept of like fight, flight, or freeze, right, that is a result of your amygdala revving up your limbic system, so more of your reactive and emotional system. So if you've ever had a difficult conversation and afterwards you're like, I don't even like remember what I said, right? Or like, man, why did I get so mad? Right? It may have been because this amygdala is really triggered. Now, there is a way to avoid this, and the way that we avoid it is we get people into their prefrontal cortex, up into the neocortex, the part of the brain where we actually can do that logical thinking and processing. And whenever we are giving feedback, that's where we want people to be, right? We want them to be able to hear the ways that they're doing things really well. We want them to hear what those opportunities for improvement are. And if you're like, oh gosh, how do I never do this again? It's actually pretty simple. So the first simple thing that you can do is by starting any feedback conversation off by getting what we at LifeLabs like to call a micro yes. And a micro yes is essentially a small question that gives people the opportunity to really opt into the conversation. And so the goal here is really to increase levels of choice and autonomy over that feedback conversation. The reason this matters is that we know surprise intensifies emotions by 400%. So if you've ever just like had someone be like, hey, real quick, here's something you're not doing well, right? It's really easy to react to that in a really strong way because we're surprised by it. And so some nuance around the micro yes, it does not need to be like overly sophisticated. It's not really about like the right words. Essentially what it is a very short question that says, hey, I would love to share some thoughts with you. Do you have some time to do so? Now, when I train managers and leaders in this concept, there can be a lot of questions around this. One of the questions that comes up is like, what if somebody says no? And to me, if somebody says no, like that actually might be a good sign that you have a really honest relationship with someone where they feel comfortable saying no. If that were to be the case, a really great follow-up might just be something like, hey, great, when would be another time for you? And again, all of this, what we are doing is we're giving some choice in the conversation. And as we think about that amygdala, what we're doing is we are also creating that moment for somebody to prepare for the conversation. So if I approach you and say, hey, do you have 10 minutes to chat about the most recent email you sent to our product team, right? And I can say, yeah, give me 5, and then I'm happy to meet. Right now I have 5 minutes to go, okay, let me look at that email. Let me get the right context. Let me understand what it is we're about to talk about. And so again, decreasing that surprise, getting people into that logic part of their brain opens up the conversation to be far more receptive. The final thing I'll say about the micro yes is I also think this is a really nice indication of, hey, I want to have a conversation. I think a great way for feedback to not be as effective is if it's just like, here, I'm going to tell you something, I'm going to leave, and you take it and go do something with it. As opposed to actually having a dialogue, having a conversation, engaging together on whatever the feedback might be. All right, step 1 to making feedback brain friendly, start with a micro yes. Next thing that I want to speak to is the importance of what it is that you say for the feedback that you're going to give. Now, there's an example on the screen, and if anybody just gristled a little because you've maybe received this feedback in your career, maybe you're feeling guilty because you're like, oh no, I gave that feedback to somebody yesterday. It's okay. I want to share what is not as effective with a statement like this. So you aren't proactive enough, right? It sounds pretty harmless. I understand what I mean when I say that. And yet the listener of it is left going, what do you mean by that? And the reason being is that proactive is what we would call a blurry word. And one of our favorite things to teach at LifeLabs is the concept of de-blurring. And so blurry feedback, blurry words are words that can be interpreted by people differently. And so at best, it leads to confusion. So it may not lead to that amygdala hijack, but I'm left going okay, well, what is it that you mean? What about proactivity? Was it yesterday? Was it a week ago? So it's not very clear. So I can't really do anything with it. And if we completely zoom out and we ask ourselves, what is actually the purpose of giving feedback, right? The purpose is that somebody actually gets some valuable information that they can go and do something with. And so if it's really vague, right, I can't do anything with it. It's not behavior driven. I don't know how to change. Or even worse, if you give me really blurry positive feedback, I don't know how to keep doing that really great thing. So when we talk about balance, we really want to make sure that we are de-blurring both our positive as well as our constructive feedback. And so the way that we get rid of blur words is we de-blur. And so a simple tip that I'll share, one of my all-time go-tos, is to think about giving feedback in a way that a camera might, right? So a camera couldn't detect that somebody wasn't proactive enough, right? But what a camera could detect is I showed up to the meeting without an agenda, right? A camera could detect that I didn't prepare for the interview with questions in advance, whatever the context might be. And so wanting to get really specific to the data, right? What could a camera see is the first step in making sure that you de-blur the feedback that you give. Now, because I want you to be really equipped to also receive feedback well, this goes both ways. So if you have somebody that approaches you and says, hey, you're not being proactive enough, right? And maybe you have a quick hijack where you have a moment of feeling defensive, a thing that you could do is say, hey, I'm having a hard time understanding that. Do you mind sharing what does proactive mean to you? So that they can de-blur for you and you can get down to the data of it. So step 2, getting to the data, picking up what a camera could see. Now, a way to get there is to really focus in on specifying the behavior you either want to see more of or that you want to see less of. And one of my ways to describe this is somebody might say something like, hey, it'd be great if you asked more questions. I wish you were more inquisitive or asked more questions, right? Okay, what's the context of that? Or why do you want me to ask more questions? And so that's where the second component comes in around adding an impact statement. And so we specify what it is we want to see, and then we want to name, right, the reason we want you to do that. And so the third piece in creating effective feedback conversations is to name the impact. I'll give you an example just so you can see what I mean by this. I'll give you a chance to read that. And essentially, you are telling people with the impact statement, here's why I'm taking the time to share this information with you. Now, again, zooming out, why does the impact statement matter? Well, one is it creates a bit of what I would say almost like weightiness to the feedback, right? It helps people understand your perspective, understand why you're sharing it with them. As the feedback giver, I also love impact statements because they're a bit of a truth serum, if you will. So I can tell you there are multiple times where like somebody has just bothered me, right? There's been something that they've said or done, and I just like, oh, I feel frustrated by it. I start writing out my feedback to them, and I get to the impact, and the impact is like, well, it bothered me, right? You're like, that's probably not going to be very helpful. So I love thinking through the impact to actually understand, is this feedback that I need to give? It is also a great tool as a leader and as a manager to understand how can maybe I needed to create expectations a little bit more clearly. And so whenever I get to the impact, I have to ask myself, like, did I even make this clear on the front end for somebody? And if I didn't, then maybe we're having a bit of a different conversation. All right, so we've covered a bunch of steps so far. So step 1, the micro yes. Step 2, data-driven, de-blurred feedback. Step 3, include an impact statement. The final component that will round out our feedback grid here is asking a question. Now, if you remember at the beginning when I talked about the micro yes, shared the importance of feedback truly being a dialogue. Nobody likes to have what I call like that hit and run feedback where it's just given to you and then somebody, ghosts and leaves you away. Right? It's really important to engage in that conversation. It builds that relationship. It builds that trust. And so a great place to round out your feedback is by asking a question. And typically I try to make these a really open question, right? What are your thoughts on this? Or how did you see that situation? How might we solve for this moving forward? This gives them an opportunity to engage and hear a little bit more around the dialogue of this feedback. So that's your 4-step grid. It is super simple. My recommendation is truly anytime you need to give feedback, like sit down with that grid, write it out, de-blur it yourself so you can get really in the habit of knowing how to give effective feedback in truly any type of context. All right, that is step 1. Here's the feedback grid. Now, I know there's been a couple questions that have come through, so give me a moment to open those up and would love to answer any questions that I can. All right. Yes. So there's a question here. There's an element here where power dynamics can also trigger the anxiety. If a manager asks, do you have a couple of minutes? That can be a terrifying and not create safety. Yes. So this comes up often when we train leaders is they'll ask like, I don't know if somebody actually would say no to me. And I agree, right? That might be the case. However, it is a signal setting action. And I think by saying, hey, do you have time to talk? We are truly creating the opportunity for somebody to have some choice in there. So it says, hey, I care about this being a good conversation for you. So you're really setting that signal. What I would also say is that naming the context of this matters. And so if you just go, hey, do you have 5 minutes to chat? Absolutely, I'm going to have an amygdala hijack, right? And especially if you're my boss, because I have no idea what we're about to talk about. Very different than saying, hey, do you have 5 minutes to talk about the meeting we just had with the customer success team yesterday? Right now, I'm in that right context. And so one way we take around decrease that hijack is by actually setting the context and letting them know what is going to be entailed in that conversation. One other piece I'll say about that is I think that this is an important element of why regular real-time feedback really matters, right? If the only time that I ever get feedback is it's constructive feedback and you start with a micro yes, every time you micro yes me, it might start to make me feel anxious, right? As opposed to feedback being part of our culture, a norm that we set, which we'll talk about in just a moment, we can start to decrease any anxiety around that. Great question. Let me check a couple more. All right, my team's leaders talk a lot about the importance of real-time feedback, their open door policy, and trend to want people to put their hands up to volunteer feedback rather than overtly inviting feedback. Yeah, it does take a lot of courage to speak up about constructive feedback. There's a nice long comment here, so I'm just trying to get to the question. What small practical tips to encourage asking for feedback in a workplace where the leaders mistakenly think they have an open door? I am so glad you asked this question because that is quite literally where we are headed. So I do have practical tips, and let's go ahead and dive into second section here about making feedback balanced. So one of the ways to make feedback balanced is by helping create a norm. And I love this question that was posed of like, oftentimes leaders are like, I'm open, I'm here anytime you have feedback for me, right? But maybe they're not actually asking it in a real way, or maybe they've asked for it a bunch. And when people have given that feedback, they've been really defensive or reactive to it, it's a great way to model that this is not a safe feedback culture. And so one thing that all of us can do, and is awesome if we can get leaders to normalize it as well, is to start normalizing what we call pulling behaviors. So if you think about feedback, there's like pushing feedback, that's me pushing it on you or giving feedback all the time. But then there's also the pull for feedback. And this is where this balance really comes in, because if I am just pushing for feedback, I am setting the tone that is our culture, right? So every organization has a feedback culture. It might be a really toxic one, it might be a really ineffective one, or it could be a really balanced and healthy one. And one way we start moving towards balance is to make sure that everyone feels like they can both invite, pull that feedback, as well as push that feedback. And so some small ways to do this, and I'll talk about this on a systemic layer here in just a couple of minutes as well, but on an individual layer, this is truly one of my all-time favorite questions, right? The 10% better question. So show of hands, again, wherever you are in your world, you can put your hand up if this is true for you. I don't know if anyone else has had the experience where someone's like, what feedback do you have for me? And you're like, anything, right? Like any feedback, like positive, constructive, about the last week, in the past year. It's actually a pretty overwhelming question, as opposed to saying like, hey, we could do it preemptively. Say, hey, we're going into this meeting with our clients, and I'm really trying to ask better questions to understand their needs. After this meeting, I would love to get your feedback on some questions you heard me ask that you thought made a difference, right? So now, as a partner for you in that conversation, I am listening for that thing that you want feedback on. So we can preemptively set people up for success to give us feedback. We can habituate, right, this norm of asking for 10% better. We'll talk even about some more meta skills in a couple of moments. The other thing that I like to be really authentic with people is, here are the things I'm looking for feedback on, right? So is if you notice as we work together and you see me doing this thing, let me know, so that folks can be more prepared to give you more practical and the feedback that you're truly looking for. So just as specificity matters in giving feedback, it also really matters in how we ask for it as well. So that pulling of feedback, it is important for all of us to do this for a variety of reasons, right? If you are an individual contributor or you're supporting individual contributors, it really shows that you are hungry for development. It shows that you are willing to learn and that you're interested in those perspectives. As a leader, as a manager, this is one way that you model this feedback, right? Or you model the feedback culture that you want to have. What I will say is, if you are a leader, the next step is really important, and that is following up. So one way that these kind of open door policies can go awry is we pull for that feedback, it goes into like a locked brain box somewhere, and then we never talk about it, right? So one of the next steps you can take is like follow up with people, and in your next email say, hey, we've gotten feedback on X, Y, and Z topic. Here's what we're going to do about it, right? Or here's what we're not going to do about it, but here are our reasons why. And so it shows that we're really listening. Going all the way back to the beginning, it's one way that we can start to build that trust, particularly in a distributed type of environment. So pulling for feedback is one key thing. In our workshop, we get into even more tips around balance, but for the sake of time, I'm going to move us into our third section. Before I do, I've seen a couple more questions come through. So give me a moment to read these, and would love to see if I can answer any of them. Yeah. So what guidance might you offer to people who are concerned with giving feedback across lines of difference and are worried about their own bias or differences of identity? Such a good question, right? When we think about how feedback shows up, it shows up in all sorts of manners, right? And there's so many dynamics at play of how we perceive one another, the biases that we might have in that. So one thing I'll say, and we actually have a whole workshop on behaviors of inclusion. Not surprisingly, one of the skills that we also talk about in that is this concept of deblurring. So let's take like a very grossly overgeneralized stereotype, right? Let's take a stereotype about women. I identify as a woman. Women are emotional, right? And maybe if you're listening to this, maybe that's feedback you've received before, right? If somebody is actually doing the diligence to understand what does emotional mean and why does it matter, they've now just created an opportunity to perhaps better understand a bias that they might have, right? So if I am forced to go, okay, what do I mean by emotional, right? I have to now figure out what were the behaviors I noticed. And now I have to figure out, and why does that matter? And when I have to do that thinking about the impact of that, right? Now I have to kind of engage in what might be maybe a difficult and or just like an enlightening conversation for myself about what biases might be. So I think there's both like an education around bias, but I also then think getting to that impact and understanding why it matters. For cross-cultural teams, right? This is a huge one. We think about the differences of teams and how people from different cultures value time, how people perceive the role of leadership. And so by de-blurring and right layered on this idea of building trust, building psychological safety, which is a whole nother session that we work with organizations on, those are some of the ways we can build the relationship. And then that way I can better understand somebody's perspective too. So I'd love to have more of a conversation, but hopefully that helps a little bit here. How has giving feedback changed in the remote world when people might be more asynchronous? Totally. I think one is there's a lot more written feedback. I think that's a key thing, is that we just don't have as much face time. So folks are depending more on whatever tools that we have. My stance as a tool is a tool. It's a matter of how you use it. And so if you are doing more written feedback, that's fine. The research doesn't necessarily support that in verbal or written is going to land better. What we do know is that we still need to get to that data-driven component of it. And in fact, some people prefer written feedback. So I think the asynchronous nature allows for more brain-friendly feedback for certain types of people. My number one tip is to actually ask people, how do you like to receive feedback? So making sure that I understand, especially as a leader, that the folks on my team prefer verbal or prefer written feedback. Some of the things I mentioned in the beginning also are some of the challenges we're seeing as people are doing that stockpiling. They're saving all their feedback for a monthly check-in. We're also seeing that people are leaning towards that negativity bias. All right, one more question here. Giving feedback remotely is so much more difficult. Do you have any ideas on how to make it easier? Yes, and I would love to know, I would love to de-blur like difficult for this person to understand what specifically is difficult. But I do think it's that we have fewer cues. And so I think one of the most important things, right, is really, I'm going to keep saying it, but going back to that de-blurring. And I think that intentional building of relationship. And so if you are a person on a cross-collaborative team and I might see you like once a month in a meeting, it's hard to have that relationship to feel like it's safe for me to give you feedback, or do I even know you well enough to do this? But if we build the norm, we build the culture around feedback, right, we're going to increase our chances of doing so. And that's kind of a cop-out because I want to transition us to share some of the tips about making it a system, because I think that might even speak to this question a little bit more. So third and final section, and wherever you're at, I know we're not together, but like take a quick stretch break. Like staring at a camera for more than 30 minutes can be challenging. So if you need to look away for a moment or stretch, I am with you in that. And I'll transition us into our next section around making it a system. And to talk about this, I'll give you all an example. So a couple of years ago, I was working with an organization and the CEO came to me and was like, code red. We've got to give feedback skills to everybody in the organization. I was like, okay, great. Like, help me understand, what are you seeing? And he's like, well, we just had a restructuring and a number of people left the organization as a result. And in their exit interviews, people were just sharing all this feedback they didn't share when they were working here. So clearly people don't know how to give good feedback. Now, if you're in the world of like people or HR, like all of your senses are probably also going off of like, it might not just be their inability to give feedback. And what came to my mind immediately in the moment is what you all see on the screen right now, which is our 3 lenses model. So whenever I'm presented a challenge like that, the first thing I want to consider is how do I think about this from a really multivariate perspective, right? How do I think about this challenge in a bit more of a complex way? And so the 3 lens model is really designed to think about challenges from different perspectives. There are a lot of different lenses that you could use. I'm going to give us a really simplified version here and to think about the person, the manager, and the systems lens. So first, if I were to take that example, right, comes to me, says folks don't know how to give feedback. Now looking at the lens, that would be that center lens, that person lens. So it is very possible people may not know how to give good feedback, right? And that is very possible. It is also possible that maybe people just don't want to give feedback. So on that person lens, typically it comes down to perhaps like a skill or a will issue. So I either don't know how to do it or I don't want to do it. But we also know people don't exist in a vacuum, right? And so I might be really hungry for feedback. I might give a lot of feedback. But if my manager never responds to my request for feedback, if my manager never gives feedback, if my manager is really defensive to the feedback I give, chances are my individual choice, I'm not going to give much feedback anymore. So the manager has an impact, right, on that individual. But our managers, our leaders, they don't exist alone either, right? There's an entire system around that as well. And so if it's an organization where the culture is one that doesn't give feedback, right? As the earlier question alluded to, right? Our senior leaders don't do this effectively. We don't have good systems, right? So I don't have a good tool. I don't have time to meet with people to give feedback. All of those are going to lead to those individual choices that show up. Okay, so why am I sharing this all? So the reason being is that whenever we are designing a feedback culture and we're thinking about really elevating systems to create a really balanced, healthy feedback culture, we want to think at each of these lenses. So some simple tips here, and then we'll go into some more specifics. First, at the individual level, one of the best recommendations I can make is train your people on how to give good feedback. And specifically, like, how do we give feedback at this organization, right? Because it might look different. I'm sure folks have had different working experiences where in some cultures, it's like very direct, it's real time, it's immediately after this situation, right? And then maybe there's cultures that are a little bit more passive. And so better understanding, right, how to train your folks in this. If you want support on that, reach out to us. This is something that we do often. So training people on how to give feedback well, also how to respond to it, and then also how to pull for that feedback. For your managers, I would recommend the exact same thing, right? So in order for our managers to really model this behavior, in order for them to help create that culture, that dynamic, they have to be able to engage in this as well. Now, you may have noticed the final thing I'll add for the manager layer is that balance component. And so there is research here. It's a bit mixed, but roughly we know that people tend to prefer more positive to constructive feedback. There's a bit of this 5-to-1 ratio. Interestingly enough, this shows up in like marriage and intimate partnership relationships. John Gottman and a lot of their research has found this kind of 5-to-1 for every one really bad thing you do, or for one every constructive piece of feedback. People crave a handful more pieces of positive feedback that can bring back some balance. It has been my experience, this is really specific to individuals, right? Some folks really crave more constructive, and some folks might need a little bit more of that positive feedback as well. So training managers, another great step. Finally, on the system side, I have 4 areas that I'm going to give you some tactical details around. So first is how to normalize it, how to make it a theme, how to create templates, and then really how to codify it. So starting here on the system level, normalizing it, one recommendation I would have is to actually take a little bit of time and to consider all of the touch points you have with employees as it pertains to feedback. So some of you may have already done a touch point map, similar to like customer journey mapping, if that's something that you've done as well. But thinking about the employee experience, what are all the moments that I will have to either receive and or give feedback? And how can we really normalize it at each of those touch points? So some great examples here, building it into your job descriptions. And so I know something that can be really challenging, right, is we put up a JD, we talk about our culture, and then people come into the organization, they're like, these two things do not match. This is very different than I anticipated. And so if you have a really strong feedback culture, and it's going to be expected that even somebody who's in their first couple of months is going to be giving feedback, to put that into the job description, right? Really define for them what feedback looks like and the type of culture you have around it. Sharing it at the importance of interviews. Now, this isn't always possible depending on the role that you're hiring for. But for example, I lead our facilitation team at LifeLabs, and they do a demo facilitation. Immediately after that demo, I ask, would you like to hear some feedback, right? Because I want them to be aware that, like, if you come and work for us, this is exactly what's going to happen. You're going to get feedback from us. You're going to get feedback from participants. So really showing them both how we give feedback, but creating that opportunity for them to engage in it. So sharing the importance of it, possibly giving it in interviews if that is relevant to the work. Clarifying it at onboarding. And so this should absolutely be a component of any type of onboarding. If you have a really, robust onboarding system, this might be like an entire 30-minute workshop that you provide. If you are more strapped, have fewer resources, maybe this is in an employee document where you've captured it for people. Weaving it into the values. So for example, at LifeLabs, one of our values is always be learning. And part of that, the behaviors defined under that value are pushing and pulling for feedback so that we can always be learning. So looking for opportunities to weave it into your values or the things that are really important to you, your principles. And then finally, pretty naturally, but adding it to performance reviews, what I would say is help your managers have better performance reviews by giving examples in whatever tools or templates you're using of what like behaviorized data-driven feedback looks like, so that we ensure folks are giving that good feedback. All right, so step one, normalize it by doing that touch point map. A couple other system level tips. Create a feedback theme. And I'll share, this is a bit of a case study from us at LifeLabs. So in 2020, when remote was happening, right, we too, like many organizations, were experiencing some of the dynamics of now having a feedback culture in a really distributed environment. And so we got a task force together and they did a bunch of research and, interviewed people and listening tours and decided to propose what we called Lobster Feedback Month. Now, if you're like, what does a lobster have to do with feedback? That's a great question. And I'll share the story here. So there's actually a great short video online about this, but the way that lobsters grow, they actually outgrow their shells. And so as they grow, it starts to get super confining and really uncomfortable. And so they have to shed that shell and then go find safety for a while they grow that shell. And so lobster became this language, a shorthand for us to engage in what felt like maybe uncomfortable conversations. So to the question earlier, if it's somebody I don't work with that regularly, but I have feedback, what it looked like is I'd say, hey, lobster feedback moment, but the way that your email came across was X, Y, and Z. Can we have a conversation about it? So it became this shorthand way of saying, hey, my intentions are good, but this might be a little messy. It might be a little uncomfortable. And so ways that we really normalize this, so we use that language. We also engaged in a lot of meta feedback conversations. And so at LifeLabs, everything is meta because we train people on these skills. But what we did is I would give someone feedback and then afterwards I'd say, hey, just out of curiosity, how is that conversation for you? So moving away from the content of the feedback and more so just, hey, how was my feedback in the first place? That's a great way to create some habitual learning around feedback. The Lobster Feedback Month, I spoke to that as well. Another area that we did to try and normalize some of that polling behavior is we use Slack at LifeLabs. And what we had folks do, we asked them if they wanted to, was to actually change in their Slack name. They put in parentheses the thing that they were working on getting better at. And so that's still there. Somebody, I think our CEOs right now says like coaching, right? And so she is saying, hey, I'm working on my coaching skills. And so now when I have one-on-ones with her, right, I'm paying attention to how is she coaching me in that so I can give her more feedback on it. And then measuring this, right? So I would recommend putting a type of question like this into any pulse surveys you do, engagement surveys, to really measure, are people getting the type of feedback that it is that we hope they are, right? They're getting ongoing feedback. All right, so those are 2 tips. Let me share a couple more and then I'll check the questions before we run out of time. The next one, make it really easy for people to give feedback. And the thing that we see working really well is just creating templates, right? So creating templates and nudges for folks. Whenever I'm thinking about creating behavior change and transformation in an organization, right? The first question I ask is like, how can I make this as simple as possible for people to engage in? So things that you can consider is building feedback prompts into one-on-one templates. So if you have templates for your managers to use around one-on-ones, right, add a prompt around here 3 great ways to ask for feedback, right? Normalizing that in any type of one-on-one. Your retros are a great example. So ensuring that after we do projects, right, we get together and say what worked, right? What didn't work well? How do we want to work together better in the future? So for example, in all of our strategic planning documents at LifeLabs, we have like what the goals are, the objectives, the measurables, the metrics. And then at the bottom, we go back at the end of the quarter and there's an entire section that says retro. And so I, as the project driver, then fill that in and request feedback from the folks I worked with. User manuals, other great way to access this. So as I was speaking about earlier, a really nice way to customize feedback to individuals is to understand how they like to receive feedback. So user manuals are a great way to do that. I've seen user manuals show up in many different facets. Folks typically ask about personality styles, ways of working, maybe just some like basic get to know you information. But one of those questions can be, here's how I like to receive feedback. A couple other ones, stakeholder checkpoints. And so perhaps you have like some project planning templates that people in your organization can use, right? You could add in there feedback checkpoints. And so I know that's something we build into all of our planning is we do a 30% feedback checkpoint. And so I'll check in with stakeholders, pull for feedback before the project continues on. And then finally, providing feedback polling tools, right? So there are lots of Slack bot integrations. I know, there are so many different types of feedback tools out there. There's Lattice and Zugata and Culture Amp, lots of different ones that you can use. PaveStep is another one to help more opportunity for people to give feedback in a particular way. Key takeaway here, avoid seasonal feedback, right? People typically get a lot of feedback around performance reviews, and then it is quiet until the next performance review. So think about avoiding that seasonal feedback. All right, final one I will speak to is to really codify feedback points. So as a project kicks off, right, making sure that you do a true kickoff, right, and asking people even what do they hope to learn or what skill do they want to develop. So as I spoke about our strategic planning documents, one of the final questions in there, like below the timeline, is, and what skill are you trying to develop? Right. So if I try to say, complex project managing, right now my stakeholders in that project know what I'm trying to develop, then give more feedback about that. And then really codifying retros. So retro does not have to be really fancy. Stands for retroactive, right? So looking back on how it went, right? What worked well, what could be 10% better, right? What learnings can be transferred? And we know so much learning happens on the job, but we miss a lot of it because we don't take that moment to pause. So we've covered a ton in here. I hope that all of these pieces were helpful. Again, kind of going back to the setup for this section is all about thinking about that 3 lenses. And so if we want a really healthy feedback culture, right, we need to give people the skills, but we also have to then design the systems that are going to reinforce the skills and behaviors that we've trained people on. All right. If we are together, I would love to know, what have you seen working well? But here are some next steps. I'll give you a moment to read through that here. I'm going to check the chat. We probably have time for 1 or 2 final questions to see if any more came through. And it looks like they haven't. So here's how I'm going to wrap us up. So what to do next? Practice these skills. So my challenge would be maybe go share this with one other person. Like, here's one thing I learned, so you can have some accountability. And then practice polling and asking for feedback. I'm going to give you a great opportunity to give us some feedback here in just a moment when I get to the next slide. But if you would like more resources on how to bring feedback training to your organization, or you are interested in some of the other skills I talked about today, reach out to us. We have program consultants who are expert at really driving transformation in organizations. They would be happy to talk to you about that. So the final ask I have before I send it back to Jay here is, there is a link in chat that will be coming your way. You can also follow the QR code on the screen. As Jay said at the beginning, this feedback has been really instrumental in understanding the types of sessions that we can provide and partner with, but also to understand what other topics might be interested, and then what could have made this session 10% better. So that is my part here. I'm going to kick it back to Jay to close us out for the day.
McKendry, thank you so much. That was really, as you say, you covered a ton of ground, and I hope all of you got as much out of that as I did. I took a couple of notes that just really jumped out at me, sort of specific creative things. The lobster theme and the lobster metaphor, really, really useful. I love the idea of thinking about, like, what is a camera capture versus, muddy language. Making feedback part of the job description and onboarding, not a thing I had thought of before, and really love that. We certainly at Charter do we do user manuals at the outset, and I endorse that as well. And then avoiding the seasonal feedback, maybe kind of obvious, but I think important to reiterate. So Thank you for that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thanks for filling out the feedback survey if you're in the process of doing that right now. And then lastly, just a reminder to click on the link that should be in the chat right now to register for the next session, which will be on February 22nd on Productivity Lab, also run by LifeLabs Learning. We look forward to seeing you then. And again, you can go back and look at some of those sessions on demand from last year that touched on some of the things that McKendry discussed today: management in general, inclusive leadership, leading through change, meetings mastery, are all part of the 2022 sessions, and we encourage you to check those out. We look forward to seeing you next month. We look forward to seeing you out there in general, and thanks again for joining today.